Donald Trump just made a move that no American president has ever made against an ally. He froze $89 billion in Canadian government and institutional accounts sitting inside American banks. And he didn't use a trade tool to do it. He didn't use a tariff. He used the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the same devastating financial weapon the United States reserved for Iran after the hostage crisis. The same weapon used to lock Russian oligarch money after the invasion of Ukraine. The same legal hammer swung at North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela. Rogue states, terrorist sponsors, enemy nations. And Trump just pointed it at Canada. What happened next will be studied in economics classrooms for the next 100 years. Because Mark Carney's response didn't just absorb the blow, it turned it into a catastrophic own goal. Within 6 hours, Carney triggered the largest single-day movement of foreign sovereign assets out of American financial institutions in the entire history of the global financial system. $2.3 trillion in motion because of one sentence. 12 words that will echo through global finance for a generation. Warren Buffett called it the most self-destructive financial decision by an American president since Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. But here's the part that should make every person in Washington lose sleep tonight. Trump froze $89 billion that was barely there. Canada had already moved its money, quietly, methodically, over 90 days. The freeze was a gun aimed at an empty vault, and Carney used it to convince the entire world to empty theirs. Let's walk through exactly what happened. The executive order was signed Sunday evening. It took effect Monday morning. It invoked IEEPA, the legal authority that grants the president extraordinary power to freeze foreign assets when the executive branch declares a national emergency. This is not a routine policy instrument. This is not leverage at a negotiating table. This is the most powerful financial weapon in the American arsenal. Every single previous deployment of this statute targeted nations hostile to American interests, nations the United States considered dangerous, adversaries, rogue governments, sponsors of global terrorism. Trump just aimed it at the country that shares the world's longest undefended border with America. The order froze 3 categories of assets: Canadian government accounts held in U.S. banks, Crown Corporation accounts belonging to Canadian state-owned enterprises, and Canadian institutional investment accounts, including pension funds and university endowments. Total frozen, approximately $89 billion. The legal justification cited an economic emergency caused by what it called hostile Canadian trade actions threatening American national security. Legal scholars tore that justification apart within hours. IEEPA requires a genuine national emergency. A trade dispute with a democratic partner, a NATO ally, a G7 nation, a Five Eyes intelligence partner does not meet that threshold, not even close. The freeze was immediate. No phase-in period, no warning, no diplomatic notification of any kind. Canadian financial officials discovered what had happened the same way you discover your card is declined at a grocery store. Their transactions failed to execute. Wire transfers bounced. Accounts were locked. Canada's finance ministry learned about it from panicked calls from its own banking institutions. Not from the White House, not from a diplomatic cable, from its banks, calling in a panic, because a foreign government had locked their accounts overnight without a single word. The intended logic was simple and brutal. With $89 billion frozen, Canada would feel financial pain severe enough to bring it to the negotiating table on American terms. The accounts were leverage. The money was a hostage. It was the logic of a kidnapper applied to sovereign finance, and it assumed the victim had no plan. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. Because Mark Carney is not a politician who stumbled into finance. He spent 13 years at Goldman Sachs learning exactly how money moves through the global system. He ran the Bank of Canada through a global financial crisis. He ran the Bank of England through Brexit. He had seen what financial weapons look like from the inside, and he had been preparing for exactly this scenario for months. 6 hours after the freeze took effect, Carney stood at a podium in Ottawa. His opening sentence sucked the air out of every newsroom on the planet. I want to assure Canadians and the international community that Canada's financial position is secure. The actions taken by the United States this morning affect approximately $12 billion in Canadian institutional assets, not $89 billion. $12 billion. The room went completely silent. Carney explained. Canadian intelligence, working alongside the Bank of Canada, had assessed the probability of an American asset freeze for the previous 4 months. Once that assessment moved from possible to probable, Canada initiated what its finance ministry internally called Operation Sovereign Shield. Over 90 days, Canada systematically, silently, withdrew its sovereign and institutional assets from American financial institutions. Transfers were calibrated in size and timing to avoid triggering market surveillance. Assets were moved to Canadian domestic banks, to the Bank of England, to the European Central Bank's custodial facilities, and into a newly established Canadian sovereign wealth vehicle domiciled in Switzerland. Every transfer was documented. Every receiving institution was prearranged. The operation was executed with the precision of a central banker who understood exactly how global capital flows, because he had spent his entire career mastering it. Of the $89 billion the United States believed it was freezing, $77 billion had already been moved. What remained, approximately $12 billion, was deliberately left in place. Residual balances in accounts that would have raised red flags if completely emptied. Canada had left just enough to keep the door looking closed while quietly using the back exit for 3 months. Trump pointed a gun at a vault that Carney had already emptied. That was move 1. Move 2 came within the hour. Canada froze all American government and corporate assets held in Canadian financial institutions under the Special Economic Measures Act. Total frozen, approximately $143 billion. This included U.S. corporate subsidiary operating accounts across every major American company doing business in Canada, American pension fund investments in Canadian equities, U.S. government securities held through Canadian intermediaries, American bank branch operating capital, $143 billion frozen by Canada versus $12 billion actually captured by the United States. The kidnapper had just discovered 2 things simultaneously. The hostage had already escaped, and the hostage had more hostages of their own. 12 times more. Move 3 was the move that broke markets. Carney returned to the podium. This time, he addressed the international community directly. If the United States of America will freeze the financial assets of its closest ally, a NATO partner, a G7 nation, a Five Eyes intelligence partner, then no nation's assets held in American financial institutions are safe. Not European assets, not Japanese assets, not Korean assets, not Australian assets. Then he delivered the sentence: "Your money in American banks is not a deposit. It is a hostage." 12 words, and they broke the global financial system. Not because they were dramatic, because they were true. Every finance minister, every central banker, every sovereign wealth fund manager who heard those words knew instantly what the rational response was: move your money. Move 4 was total financial decoupling. Carney announced the immediate activation of a Canadian-European settlement platform for all bilateral trade with EU nations, bypassing the US dollar entirely. He announced bilateral currency swap agreements with Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and Australia. He announced that all Canadian sovereign reserves would be held exclusively in non-American institutions going forward, not as a temporary measure, as permanent policy. 4 moves. 6 hours. Vault emptied. Counter ratio of 12-1. A sentence that told the entire world their money wasn't safe. The freeze was a pistol. Carney turned it into a nuclear weapon. The markets responded, not to the freeze itself. The freeze was manageable once Carney revealed only $12 billion was actually captured. The markets responded to the global warning, to 12 words, to the sudden realization that every foreign government holding assets in American banks had just been handed a rational reason to move them somewhere else. The Dow began falling the moment Carney's second statement hit the wires. Bank stocks led the collapse. J.P. Morgan Chase dropped 9%. Bank of America fell 12%. Citigroup cratered 14%. Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, all down between 8 and 15%. The sector-wide decline was the worst single-day performance for American bank stocks since the early days of the pandemic. The mechanism was structural. When foreign governments withdraw sovereign assets from U.S. banks, those banks lose deposits. They lose the cheap funding that foreign capital provides. Their balance sheets weaken. Their capacity to lend contracts. Norway's sovereign wealth fund initiated an emergency review of its U.S. financial exposure within hours. Saudi Arabia's public investment fund began precautionary transfers. Singapore's GIC and Temasek issued formal statements about reassessing jurisdictional concentration risk. The European Central Bank convened an emergency session. Total estimated assets beginning transfer or review protocols within 24 hours. $2.3 trillion. Think about that ratio for a moment. Trump froze $89 billion in Canadian assets, of which only $12 billion was actually there. Carney's response triggered the movement or review of $2.3 trillion in global assets away from American institutions, a ratio of nearly 200 to 1. The US dollar dropped 3.2% against a basket of major currencies, the worst single-day decline in over a decade, not driven by trade data, not driven by economic fundamentals, driven by the evaporation of trust. The dollar's reserve currency status, the invisible privilege that allows the United States to borrow cheaply, project financial power globally, and fund its own government at favorable rates, depends entirely on one thing: foreign governments trusting that their dollar assets are protected from political interference. That trust was destroyed in a single executive order. Then Warren Buffett spoke. Berkshire Hathaway holds massive positions in U.S. bank stocks. The crash was costing his company billions in real time as he made his statement. "I've been investing in American financial institutions for 60 years. Today, for the first time in those 60 years, I'm questioning that decision." Freezing an ally's bank accounts is the financial equivalent of burning your own house down to spite your neighbor. Except the house you burn is the one where everyone else keeps their valuables. The American financial system is the world's bank. Countries park their reserves here because they trusted that their money is safe from political risk. That trust took 80 years to build. It was destroyed by a single executive order freezing the accounts of America's closest ally. On Carney's response, Buffett was precise. Carney didn't need to defeat the freeze. The freeze defeated itself. All he needed to do was point at it. Say to the world, "Look what they did to us. You're next." One sentence, 12 words. Your money in American banks is not a deposit. It is a hostage. That sentence will cost the United States more than any tariff, any sanction, any trade war, any military action in its history. Buffett then revealed that Berkshire had begun reducing its U.S. bank stock exposure 12 months ago. Not because of this specific order, because the pattern had made something clear. The American financial system was being transformed from a global service into a political weapon. And political weapons, he said, are poor long-term investments. The rest of the world is reaching the same conclusion today that we reached a year ago. The difference is we had 12 months to prepare. They have 12 hours. His closing verdict was precise and devastating. The dollar is worth whatever the world's trust in American institutions is worth. Today, that trust is worth significantly less than it was yesterday. Trust takes generations to build. It takes moments to destroy. This is the most self-destructive financial decision by an American president since Nixon closed the gold window. The global fallout exceeded every projection. 11 sovereign wealth funds formally announced diversification reviews within 48 hours. Combined assets under review, approximately $4.7 trillion. The European Central Bank accelerated plans for a euro-based alternative to dollar clearing systems. China expanded yuan settlement agreements with a dozen additional nations. And Canada, the country that was supposed to be brought to its knees, Canada's financial system was functioning normally. Canadian banks reported increased deposits as international institutions repatriated assets. The Toronto Stock Exchange actually rose slightly as international investors concluded Canada was the safer jurisdiction for their capital. The weapon hit the wrong target. It was designed to hurt Canada. Canada's markets went up. America's went down. U.S. bank CEOs were in open revolt. Jamie Dimon reportedly told a senior official, "You just gave every foreign government on earth a reason to take their money out of our banks. Do you have any idea what that does to our deposit base?" The Federal Reserve held emergency discussions about liquidity support. American banks were losing foreign deposits in real time. Not a panic-driven run, not hysteria, a rational, orderly, permanent reallocation by the most sophisticated institutions on earth. Institutions that had just been told by the actions of the American executive branch itself that parking their reserves in the United States carried political risk. Here is where things stand. Trump signed an executive order to freeze $89 billion in Canadian accounts. Canada had already moved $77 billion, leaving only $12 billion actually frozen. Carney counterfroze $143 billion in American assets, a 12-to-1 ratio. Then he told the world their money in American banks is a hostage. That sentence triggered the movement of $2.3 trillion in global assets away from American institutions. Bank stocks lost $340 billion in market cap. The dollar suffered its worst decline in a decade. 11 sovereign wealth funds initiated withdrawal reviews totaling $4.7 trillion. The EU accelerated euro internationalization. China expanded the yuan. The power of the dollar was never about military strength. It was never about GDP. It was never about the size of the American economy alone. It was about trust. The invisible, foundational, 80-year-old understanding that money parked inside the American financial system was protected from political interference. That trust was the single most valuable asset the United States possessed. It was destroyed in one executive order, signed by a president who thought he was punishing Canada. He wasn't punishing Canada. Canada had already left. He was punishing the dollar. He was punishing every American bank that depends on foreign deposits. He was punishing every American whose retirement savings sit in funds holding bank stocks. He was punishing 330 million Americans who depend on the stability of a financial system the rest of the world is now quietly, rationally, permanently deciding to walk away from. Trump froze Canada's accounts thinking he was holding a hostage. Carney showed the world the vault was empty, counter-froze 12 times the amount, and said 12 words that will echo through global finance for the next century. Your money in American banks is not a deposit. It is a hostage. That sentence cost the United States more than any tariff, any trade war, any military conflict in its entire history.